Welcome back. And as was mentioned earlier in the show, the focus of this segment is going to be looking at the work of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Belize. And I have joining me at this time via Skype Katie Tobin, who is the Senior Protection Associate for the UNHCR. Good morning, Katie.
Hi, good morning.
Well, I want to thank you, obviously, for taking the time out to join us for this interview.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me back.
That's right. We've had you in studio before, actually, when the offices were just getting started within Belize.
That's right. I think it was back in early December.
That's right. Okay, Katie, and obviously the issue of the work of UNHCR and refugee status in Belize has come up on the front burner once again. I want to take the opportunity to be able to look back and kind of just get an overview as to the work of UNHCR and talk a bit about the project that you're here working on.
Great. Well, thank you. And just to start, UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, we're the agency within the United Nations that has been mandated to offer protection to refugees and asylum seekers and work with governments to provide protection to refugees throughout the world. And UNHCR is increasingly engaged in Latin America, in Central America, surrounding what we're seeing happening in what we call the Northern Triangle of Central America, and Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So we have been increasing our presence in countries like Belize that have been particularly affected by this new and growing refugee situation in the region. In Belize, many people may remember the work that UNHCR did back in the 80s and 90s. We had a formal office, a presence in Belmopan back during that era. Right around the time that the Refugee Act was passed in 1991 is when we opened our doors. We worked with the government at that time to process claims with people that had been fleeing the civil wars in the region, in El Salvador and Guatemala, Nicaragua, to offer protection under the new Refugee Act. We are now in 2015 and now 2016 re-engaging with Belize to try to again provide the support that they need, that the government needs to respond to this new conflict in the region. So since I personally arrived in Belize in October, and this was right after the government had announced the reactivation of the Refugee Eligibility Committee, which is the interministerial and actually many members from the private sector as well, who come together to make decisions on individual claims. So during the initial months that I was there, we did a lot of training, capacity building, making sure that the members of these appointed members of the committee were prepared, had the background in refugee law and the understanding of the country conditions in the countries where people are coming to adequately make these decisions. We started meeting monthly to actually process individual claims. We've met now 5 times and have doing our best to very expeditiously process the claims so that decisions can be made and people who are deserving of protection or offered protection. We really want to create a formal process, as quickly as we can. So UNHCR is committed to continue to increase our presence in Belize and work hand in hand with Minister Castillo, the Refugee Eligibility Committee, the new appointed Director of Refugees, Maria Marin, to really take their lead and do what we can to respond to this humanitarian crisis that's very much affecting Belize.
And this is part of the backdrop I wanted to be able to look at. What are some of the current situations that we're seeing within Central America that has allowed for or that has necessitated this process?
Right, so UNHCR has been following this very closely. We've really seen an uptick in displacement, people having to flee their homes from violence starting in around 2008. when we look back to the other era, the other time when we had a real refugee situation in Belize, it was more of a result of these civil wars. Now it's more at the hands of non-state actors. So we're seeing that increasingly in the last 5-6 years, that these transnational criminal organizations and very influential gangs have taken strongholds in these countries in the region, taking over towns and villages, extorting large portions of the population, forcefully recruiting young men and women, boys and girls, and so it's different than what we've seen in the past, but it's putting many lives at danger, and people are being forced to make a very difficult decision to leave their home. So we're seeing that increasingly, and it seems to be almost reaching a boiling point now, where these criminal organizations have such a stronghold, particularly in El Salvador and Honduras, but also Guatemala, where people are left with no other choice but to leave their home and their home country.
Now, I recall in our last conversation, a part of the process is being able to not only have new persons apply for refugee status, but those who are already in country. Is that the case?
Yes, so anyone has the right to apply for asylum. We know that some people had actually fled the conflict maybe a year or two ago. As I said, this isn't brand new. It didn't start just last year. We've been seeing an increase in the influence of these criminal organizations over the last several years. So some, may have fled their homes a few years ago, and reach safety here in Belize. And now that the Refugee Eligibility Committee is active, they're now able to access formal legal protection. But they may not have arrived just within the last few months.
Now, looking at the criteria, and that is a very essential part of the process, understanding the reasons as to why a person has fled their country and whether or not that makes them eligible to be classified as a refugee. Let's talk about that.
Right, because not everybody does classify as a refugee. It's actually, the standard's quite high. There's many requisites that one has to meet to be eligible for refugee status in Belize or in any country. Under the Belize Refugee Act, to be a refugee, you have to establish that you have a well-founded fear of persecution. So persecution being some very severe form of harm like death or their violation of one's fundamental human rights. And then they have to establish that fear of severe harm, persecution, is on account of either their race, their religion, potentially their political opinion, their membership in a particular group profile within society that's being targeted at the time. And so they have to link that harm that they fear upon return with one of these what we call 5 protected grounds. So that's why this whole training phase has been so key, because the decision makers here in Belize have had to really go through quite a bit of training to know how to make these legal determinations.
Now, you said the Refugee Eligibility Committee comprises both government and non-government organizations. Who are some of the members?
So there's 9 members of the committee, and it's actually defined in the Refugee Act who's represented in the eligibility committee. It's of course the Ministry of Immigration chairs the committee, and then UNHCR has a seat on the committee, as well as the Ministry of the Attorney General, the Ministry of Human Development, the Ministry of National Security. I know I'm gonna miss one of them. Let's see. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course. And then we have the trade union as a representative, the Belize Council of Churches, as well as the Chamber of Commerce.
Okay.
So
And
it's really great. I think, it was lovely for me to have the opportunity to get to work with this committee, to have representation from so many different sectors of Belize society coming together to decide, who is worthy of protection. I think it's a really great model that Belize has established.
And in the past 5 meetings that have been held with with the committee, it's been primarily training them to be able to process applications?
Well, we've done periodic trainings. The last one was actually last month. But when we meet monthly for the duration of the day to actually make decisions on individual cases. So we've met 5 times to make decisions in addition to ongoing training.
So let's talk about the actual procedure and the process of vetting.
Sure. So the beginning, there's several phases to the process, and the first phase, of course, is accessing the process. What UNHCR calls registration. So that's when somebody submits an application for refugee status in Belize, and UNHCR is currently working with the government in that initial phase of the process. The second and very critical stage of the process is what we call the refugee status determination. And that is conducted by an eligibility officer, a refugee officer who has had extensive training and adjudication of refugee claims. The interview normally lasts about an hour, sometimes 2 hours, and the applicant is asked many questions about their experience before they fled their country, why they fear returning, and then a variety of other, security-related questions to determine that they're, not only eligible for refugee status, but also otherwise admissible, here in Belize. And so after that decision is made, an assessment is drafted, a legal assessment, and that's submitted to the eligibility committee so that they are able to make an informed decision on the case. So that would be phase 3 when the committee makes their decision. And then phase 4, of course, is it goes before the Minister Castillo, for her ultimate approval of the case. And then if the case is approved, then that person would be recognized as a refugee in Belize and be given protection against being returned, where, of course, protection against the persecution that they fear. If the case is denied, then they have the opportunity to appeal under the Belize Refugee Act. And ultimately, if the case is denied, then they would need to either return to their country or seek other, immigration benefits that go through some other channel within the established laws of Belize.
Katie, since it was last year that this process initiated following the training, how many applications have been processed? How many applications have been submitted and processed? Hello?
I lost you. I can't hear you.
Yes. Can you hear me now? Okay. I'm asking, since the initiation of the process, how many applications have been submitted and the process initiated?
Well, I can tell you the number of cases that have been reviewed and decisions made. That's, I believe, 92 cases.
Okay.
I'm not sure to date exactly how many cases have been submitted. Of course, it changes week to week, but the committee has made decisions on almost 100 cases.
Okay, so out of 192 were?
I believe 92 have been reviewed, so nearly 100 cases.
Okay. And we were told there was a couple hundred applicants that have actually applied for the process.
That is correct. I am not able to give you an official number, but there's quite a backlog at this point. There have been many people that have registered since the activation of the committee last year.
Okay.
So actually, that's one priority for UNHCR is to do what we can to bring more visibility to Belize and more resources, because really in order to have a fully functioning refugee program, more resources will be needed. More eligibility officers to conduct the interviews, more staff to do registration, and then there's just we see in countries like the United States or Mexico or Costa Rica that have a little bit more of an established refugee program, there's a need for, of course, more human resources.
That's right. And of course, the applicants are primarily from the three Central American countries that we spoke of: El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala.
That's right.
Okay. Now, the process at this point is for asylum. That's the way. There's also the UN, the Transfer Protection Program that is currently being proposed at this point. How do you differentiate the two programs for the public to be able to understand what you're doing?
Right. So right now, UNHCR is working with the government to process asylum claims or refugee claims in country. So people that have arrived on their own and have affirmatively applied to the program and have requested protection with the government of Belize. The protection transfer arrangement that you mentioned is something that has not yet been decided. It's something that UNHCR has proposed to the government of Belize. Something that it's a new initiative. It's part of UNHCR's regional strategy. Something we're really excited about. We think that it's an innovative, mechanism that will hopefully save lives for some of the most vulnerable people in the Northern Triangle. People that are, facing severe persecution. Their lives are at risk, but they're not able to access protection in their country, for instance, in El Salvador and Honduras. And so we're looking to be able to transfer them out of their country for temporary stay in Belize while they would be processed for resettlement in a third country, countries like the United States and potentially Canada. And so, UNHCR is really excited about this program because, like I said, we think it'll save lives. But I also personally, having worked in Belize, think that it's a really great opportunity for Belize to take a leadership role in the region, in the regional response, bring more visibility, and hopefully with visibility, more resources and support for the work that Belize is doing, to really respond to the crisis in the region. Belize is a small country; it can't do it alone. So, I think the more visibility and resources we can bring to the country, the better. So but again, this is something that hasn't been approved. It's before cabinet right now. And so really the only thing that is happening currently is the domestic refugee program.
Now, what happens, and I do want to agree, obviously, government has also made that position clear as well, that the protection transfer program hasn't been approved as yet. It's just a proposal at this point. However, those who are seeking asylum, it is an ongoing program at this point. The 92 applicants that have been reviewed, what is the status of those applications at this point? Are they now at the desk of the Minister of Immigration?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so they're pending approval at this point?
Yes, they're at the final stage. That's right.
What happens after a person currently living in Belize is approved for refugee status?
Well, once a person is approved, they would be given permission to remain. I believe that the details are being worked out exactly what status refugees will be given in Belize, but it tends to lead towards permanent residency, and then after a period of years, citizenship. That's certainly what we saw happen for the refugees that were recognized in the 90s. And that's what UNHCR would recommend to any country, that once a refugee is recognized, that they be given all the same rights and privileges of other permanent residents in the country, so that they can sufficiently contribute to the country, that they can legally work, that they can purchase property, that they can access health care. And I think it's actually more vulnerable for the individual, but also for the country when people don't have an official legal status. So I think that's the direction that we would be going in. Now,
I understand, obviously, from the UN perspective, and obviously just looking at it from a global perspective, the humanitarian aspect of taking in refugees and accepting their status. The concern on the local front, and I'm sure you're accustomed to this in other areas, and we've seen even in Europe with the refugee crisis there is resources. Having additional persons in your country to be able to provide healthcare, housing, and other issues. What is the support that is offered, whether facilitated through the UN or other organizations, for when, even if it's 92 new persons become approved refugees in the country?
Right. Well, UNHCR is committed, as I mentioned before, to do whatever we can to help Belize. We know that Belize, has resource constraints, and so especially for these new arrivals, we're working very closely in the communities, ensuring that that people find housing, that they have access to health care. We provide sometimes food assistance and things like that, so that people are not, a tax on Belize society. What we find, both in Belize and throughout the world, is that refugees tend to be extremely motivated, hardworking individuals, survivors, and they come to the country that's offering them safety, and they want to contribute. So, I saw that every day working with the refugees, the asylum seekers in Belize. They were so eager to be able to start working and integrate and learn English. They were asking us to set up a program so that they could learn English. They want their children to be Belizean. There's a real desire to give back to this country that's been so generous to them. So while initially, I think that there's certainly a lot of support that's needed to help these people that have just fled something very traumatic and maybe come with having to abandon everything that they own in order to make it safely to Belize. So UNHCR is stepping in and trying to really provide that support so that the government doesn't have to do it alone. But I think in the long term, what we find is that these people give more than they take from the country that is protecting them.
And similarly, in the same vein, are there stipulations or perhaps guidelines in terms of being able to process applications, perhaps approve the status of refugees with a cap in mind, perhaps on a yearly basis?
I don't believe that there is a cap. That's not something that UNHCR would advocate for, and I don't believe that that's defined in the law.
And the protection transfer program, would it eventually, if it is approved, would it eventually be linked to the asylum program and perhaps facilitate persons once approved for refugee status in Belize? Is that the vision that is in mind?
No, that is not contemplated.
Okay. Now, Katie, as I mentioned earlier, we had this conversation when you were in country last year, and it was really setting the tone for what would eventually take place, and now it has been rolled out. The concerns people had was seeing the numbers of persons going in to help for progress and having this process initiated. And perhaps people weren't aware as to the measures that were in place, the stages that had to be, that each person had to go through. What do you say in terms of being able to help to educate people that this process is transparent and that it is also very stringent in terms of ensuring that those who really need to acquire refugee status are those who are acquiring it?
Right. So first, let me just mention that these kind of large numbers that we're seeing in Belize is consistent with what UNHCR is seeing throughout the region. That's why we're so concerned about this refugee situation and really wanting to provide more support. We're seeing not only in Belize, but if you look at Costa Rica, Panama, Mexico, the U.S., exponential increases in the number of people filing asylum applications. So the numbers speak for themselves. The refugee crisis right now is really at a boiling point. So Belize is not alone, certainly, in seeing these trends, these upward trends. And so, but yes, to go to the second part of your question, the process is extremely transparent. UNHCR is working hand in hand with the Immigration Department and really following their lead. It's a process that is dictated by the Refugee Act itself, And so really what we're implementing is a very well-defined process that, is derived actually from the 1951 convention, and then, now applied in Belize. We're happy to continue to, educate the public on the process, and, do town hall meetings or whatever, meet with different interest groups, so that they can understand better who these people are and, why they're seeking protection here in Belize. And, I think, like I mentioned before, some people that are registering at Help for Progress with UNHCR will ultimately qualify as refugees based on that criteria that I mentioned before. Some will not. Some, I think, maybe arrive to Belize for other reasons, for family reunification or economic reasons. And that's why I think it's important to have a legal, formal process, because the process will ultimately weed out people that don't qualify and are not in need of international protection. So I feel personally very confident that the process is working the way it should, and that at the end, those who are worthy of protection will be granted it under the Belize system that's being established, and those that don't qualify will also be identified, and decisions will be made in accordance with that.
Well, Katie, I really want to thank you for taking the time out to join me this morning. And of course, this has been something that I know a lot of people had questions about, so hopefully we've been able to address some of the concerns. All right, I think we lost the audio there for a bit, but thank you once again.
Okay, thank you.
All right, great. And at this point, I want to say we're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we are going to be focusing on Belize's national literacy policies. Stay tuned.